Welcome to Living Outside the Matrix, the show where we examine important issues, either ignored or misrepresented in the mainstream narrative. Hi there, I'm your host, Nigel Howitt, and on the show today we're going to look at the foundations of truth. We have already discussed in a previous episode what is the nature of truth, and I recommend that you check that out. There'll be a link below. And we've determined that truth is that which corresponds to reality. Truth is what is real. And the discernment of truth, or finding out what's true and what's false, is essentially a process of identifying what is real and distinguishing it from what is unreal. So in this episode, we're going to examine the fundamental ideas on which this concept of truth rests, and ideas that make it possible, in fact, for us to discern it. So the very basic underpinning ideas that support the concept and our ability to discern it. So first of all, let's recognize that to ask what is truth, to ask what are these fundamental ideas, is necessarily in the realm of philosophy. But don't let this put you off. I know a lot of people are sort of scared away by the term philosophy. We really shouldn't. Philosophy is simply a framework, a frame of reference, a worldview, a means to understand our reality. And you can't escape having a philosophy. Everybody has a set of ideas about the world, about themselves and other men, how they fit, how the individual fits in with the world and all these other people and reality and the way we interact with it. This is all, our ability to function depends on our basic set of premises which constitute our personal philosophy. So the point is that we really don't have a choice as to whether or not we have a philosophy. Our only choice is whether or not we're actually conscious of it, because you couldn't function unless you had some basic idea about the world you live in. And the point about looking at philosophy, the benefit of looking at it, the enormous benefit of looking into the subject, is bringing all of these ideas that effectively form our mental operating system, bringing them into conscious awareness. And from there, we can check whether they're consistent, whether they're rational, whether they're really warranted, or whether one or two of those ideas may be just some crazy idea we picked up somewhere. We think, hang on, I don't actually think that. So this process of becoming conscious of the fundamental premises that determine our thinking and our values and our actions, that determine our lives, essentially. That the benefit of looking at this framework of ideas that we call philosophy can't be overstated. So, very briefly, philosophy has 5 basic branches, and it essentially sort of asks certain questions. So the base is metaphysics, and this asks the question, what is real? What is there? What exists? And this is the very sort of foundational question, if you like. The second branch of philosophy is epistemology, and this asks the question, well, how do I know? How can I be sure of things? What is knowledge? How do I achieve knowledge? This is the realm of epistemology. So when we've asked the questions, what is real? What exists? And how do I know? How can I tell? How can I be sure? We're then ready to ask the question, well, so what? What do I do about that? Which is essentially, how should I act as a human being? What should I do? How should I live? And this is encompassed in the third branch of philosophy, which is ethics. So only then, when we've got an answer to the metaphysical questions, what is, the epistemological question, how do I know, and the ethics, what should I do, how should I live, from there we can then progress on to politics, the fourth branch of philosophy, which addresses the question of how should men interact with each other. What are the guiding principles for a correct or a beneficial or an ideal social system between men? And the fifth branch of philosophy is aesthetics or art. And this asks the question, what is art? What is beauty? What is art for? What's its role in human life? So these are the five basic branches of philosophy. And in addressing the question of what is truth, in pondering what is truth, how we discern it, we are necessarily into metaphysics at the base. What is real? How do we know it? Epistemology. And we're essentially at that foundational level. We're not yet asking questions about what we should do. We're not concerning ourselves with that branch of philosophy. That's part just yet. Fundamental number one, then, is that reality is an objective absolute. Now, most people in our practical everyday lives, all of us, except for people in asylums and locked up, are acting every day on the premise that reality is a predictable, stable, objective absolute. This is actually how we operate. So this won't come as any great surprise. If we think about it just for a moment, if you were to try to cross a busy street, you would naturally assume that the cars, lorries and trucks and buses were real and that you couldn't make them not hurt you by the power of your mind. You couldn't think, no, I'm going to cross the street and just walk through this illusion of traffic and be okay. We all grasp that quite naturally. We would quite comfortably rely on our senses to inform us about reality, and we'd rely on our mind to be able to deduce when the safe time to cross the street would be. In short, we would be acting implicitly on this idea that I'm stating. Reality is an objective absolute, that A is A, things are what they are. And this idea was originally documented by Aristotle some 2,500 years ago with his law of identity and also the law of non-contradiction. So let's look at those very briefly. The law of identity states that things are what they are. A is A. To have knowledge of the chair and the table is to know that the chair's the chair and the table's the table. To exist means to have an identity. His second law, the law of non-contradiction, is a simple restatement of this, and it's an epistemological restatement of a metaphysical statement. And it's that the law of non-contradiction states that something cannot be what it is and not what it is at the same time and in the same context. So this essentially states that contradictions cannot exist. And we all know, of course, that contradictions can't exist. You can't be hot and cold at the same time. You can't be in London and in Edinburgh at the same time, or in Johannesburg and not in Johannesburg at the same time. Contradictions don't exist in reality. And this is very important for our truth discerning mission. Now, as mentioned previously, the reason we need to visit this conviction consciously and make sure we apply it universally in our thinking is the danger of the opposite. Now, the opposite view is that consciousness creates reality. And this is a very popular thought amongst New Age thinkers of modern decades, recent decades. The idea that we create our own reality, the idea that thought creates reality, the idea that our whims, our wishes, our feelings can somehow affect truth and reality, what is real. But this has very, very important connotations. If you think about it, if everybody creates their own reality, if we entertain that hypothesis for a moment, if everybody could create their own reality, if everybody would create their own truth, and this would open the door, it would necessitate opening the door to contradictions. Contradictions would have to exist. If I choose to believe what I want to believe and it contradicts with what Tom and Dick and Harry all believe, and they all believe something different, if that were possible, if that were the way it worked, then contradictions would have to exist. But we can see that contradictions don't exist, and we can experience that contradictions don't exist. So an important upshot of this is that reality, as this objective standard, this ultimate court of appeal, if you like, in disputes between men, in arguments over whether this or that is true, reality is the standard of truth. It's where we have to look, and it's our reference point that we all come to. It's where we all meet. It's the same page that we all have to be on in our pursuit of truth. This is not to say, of course, that we don't implicitly act on the opposite. The opposite, I should say, is subjectivism. The idea that reality is not an objective absolute, and that we can change it with our thoughts, actions, beliefs, whims. Sometimes we implicitly act as subjectivists, and we contradict this fundamental. Every time we evade things, the idea of not wanting to know, of just avoiding doing something, avoiding thinking about it, this action is on the implicit assumption that if I avoid it and don't look, it'll go away. Similarly with things like tantrums and sulking. The implicit message in that is that reality didn't give me what I wanted to. It didn't work right. It's gone wrong. Reality should have conformed to what I wanted. This is the implicit, unspoken, unsaid premise that this kind of behaviour acts on. And there's a third kind as well, which is sort of passive wishful thinking, just one day hoping that something will happen, holding a value in mind, maybe achieving a certain job or meeting somebody and finding love, but never really doing anything about it. The implicit premise there is that somehow I'll attract it to me and I don't have to do anything. This is the idea, contrary to reality, the idea that thoughts, whims and wishes can somehow affect reality. And of course they can't. And as a truth seeker, we need to be consciously mindful of this fundamental. So the second fundamental idea is reason is our only means to knowledge. So let's dissect that one a little bit. Not only is reason our defining attribute as human beings, what differentiates us from animals and other conscious species, but it's also our primary means of survival as human beings. We're not born with any knowledge, and everything about how to live needs to be learned, and reason is our means to gain that knowledge. It's our mechanism of learning. And whether we are learning about the world as we grow up, or whether we are trying to discern the truth about whether or not to have an experimental medical treatment, or whether or not wearing this device on your face helps you to stay healthy and well, these things are only discernible using your faculty of reason. You need to weigh up facts. You need to weigh up the argument for this course of action or that. You need to listen to both sides of the argument. You need to evaluate the logical strength of the connection between propositions. This uses reason. You must question assumptions. This uses reason. You have to think in principles and identify, continually make judgments. This uses reason. Your faculty of reason is your ability to grasp and to use logic, amongst other things. And logic, as we have seen from the law of non-contradiction, we know that contradictions don't exist. And logic is effectively the method of the truth seeker. Reason is your faculty that uses logic in the process of thinking, which is reasoning. So when you're reasoning something through, when you're thinking, when you're trying to find truth and determine what's real and what ideas correlate to reality and which don't, you are checking for logical consistency within the argument that you're hearing itself, and also in the greater context of all your other knowledge, everything else you know about reality. Does it fit with that? So this is the importance of reason, and we have to sort of thrash out why it's so important, because what is our alternative? What else do we have? What other means are at our disposal in the quest for truth? And the only other tool that we have is how we feel about things. It's our emotions. And this is where the danger lies. A great many people these days consider feelings a legitimate means of knowledge. Many fairly openly mystical people speak quite openly about this. They talk of just knowing. You have to just know in order to believe. You have to just accept something first. And it shouldn't be too difficult to see that emotions are not means of identifying any truth about objective reality, because we can all feel differently about the same thing. If there's some kind of economic crash where lots of stocks and values are falling, a lot of people are going to be feeling very bad about that. They're going to be feeling fear and anxiety. But the person in the same context, looking at the same reality, who's hedged against things or invested differently, might be feeling really excited. Think, oh, this is great, I'm about to make lots of money. So people feel differently about the same reality, depending on their values, their strategies, their contexts, etc., their knowledge. You could have two men who perceive the same woman, and to one man, he may fancy the pants off her. She may be everything he desires, and he might feel love and desire for her. The other man might see her and feel contempt and loathing. So it's quite easy to see, if we consider it for a moment, that emotions and the way we feel about things are not a reliable way of discerning what is real and what isn't. Sometimes our feelings may be right, this is true, but they're not a reliable means. They don't give us any degree of certainty with respect to our conclusions. Some people speak of hunches and intuition as another means to knowledge. Now, there can be there is a rational explanation for inspirations and hunches, because your subconscious mind is continually downloading. It holds the sum of your knowledge, and you're not consciously aware of all that knowledge all of the time, of course, but it's there. And some of the automatic subconscious functions of the human mind mean that connections can be made subconsciously. And after a long period of gaining knowledge about certain issues and then effectively turning away from it while your subconscious chews it over, and you may go and just go to sleep on an idea, or go and do something else, go and go and play a game of tennis or something and not ponder the issue on which you're consciously have been focused. And dots can be joined, and insights, inspirations can happen. And this isn't proof that our feelings and our intuition and our hunches are a reliable means to finding truth. So we have to be very cautious about that, and we have to consciously acknowledge that it is the reasoning process, our faculty of reason, and the process of using it in thinking that is our only means to arrive at truth at an acceptable level of certainty, which would be beyond a reasonable doubt. Another popular idea for a legitimate means to truth and knowledge is, of course, mysticism. And this idea is essentially that there's some kind of shortcut to knowledge. One doesn't need to put in all that effort of thinking and reasoning and reading and researching and finding out and examining the facts of reality. We can get a shortcut with a channeled message from some higher being, or we can meditate and get messages from our higher self, or whatever we call it. I don't mean to single out any particular alleged mystical means, but all of these non-rational supposed ways to access truth and gain knowledge are an illusion. They are not that. There's no way they can give you any degree of certainty. And this forms of mysticism creep into the lives of so many people. It's quite staggering. But it must be recognized for the truth seeker, if we're serious about absolute certainty, and that can be achieved, for finding, well, not absolute certainty, but beyond a reasonable doubt level of certainty that can be achieved in the quest for truth. We can know reality. If we're serious about that, we must consciously reject all forms of mysticism, because mysticism is essentially the belief that reasons are unnecessary. Mysticism, whether in the form of organized religions, such as Catholicism, the one I was raised with, or any of the other major religions, or whether mysticism comes in the form of the New Age stuff, any form of knowing without reasons, of wishful thinking, of jumping to conclusions without any rational basis, without any empirical evidence, without any logical argument to persuade the listener. We have to be very suspicious of all of these. Mysticism, by its very definition, is non-rational. And I would always advocate that we aim for consistency in our mental operations. And either we're rational men, either we are practitioners of genuine scientific method, either we value evidence and the facts of reality, or we don't. There isn't a halfway house. We can't sometimes reach for the mystical idea and say, we'll just accept that one. Whether we allege that we feel it, or God says it, or the angels told me in my sleep, or whatever. Any non-rational, i.e. mystical, source of supposed knowledge must rationally be treated with skepticism. It's crucial, in effect, for us to know what we know and know what we don't really, or know what we can't be sure of, I should say. The things that we can put in a box marked maybe, but we'll never know. Reincarnation, for example. People talk with conviction as though we are eternal beings, when there's actually no solid evidence to back that up. It's a great idea, and indeed it might be true. But while we've got no evidence for it, we cannot operate on the assumption that it is true. That is mysticism. That is acting on non-evidence, on a non-rational basis. And that is what the truth seeker needs to be particularly aware of. The temptation with mysticism, of course, is to be a part-time mystic and to cherry pick the odd idea that we can assimilate into the sum of our knowledge that is faith-based, that has no rational support, it has no evidence to back it up. And it's tempting to think that we can get away with this without any negative results. But in fact, this is to undercut the functioning of our consciousness in its entirety. It's to undermine our capacity to be certain of anything. As soon as you allow your consciousness to, in everything else, we're going to be rational, we're going to look for the facts, we're going to be certain, we're going to achieve knowledge based on the facts of reality. Oh, but just here, we're going to allow something to slip in, we're going to believe in reincarnation or something. The danger with this is that it's like a virus in the mental operating system, and it effectively undercuts our capacity for certainty and all of our mental operations. Fundamental number 3, reality is knowable. If we consider once again the crossing a busy street scenario, all of us would, in our everyday lives, not hesitate to clock the scene, the traffic, and make a judgment and cross the street. At no point would any of us consider that it was impossible to be able to do so. How can I trust my senses? I can't possibly know when to do this and how to do it. Of course, the street may be so busy that it's a very difficult challenge, and you may judge that it's not a crossing that you want to make, but that's a separate issue. You would be fully confident in trusting your senses and your faculty of reason in evaluating the danger and making a decision as to when to cross. So in that respect, we all demonstrate that reality is completely knowable. So the opposite conviction, again, the fact that some people will say that, oh, you can't possibly know what's true, experts are always disagreeing, it's unknowable. But if you really look at this idea of unknowable, really, in order to say that something was unknowable, you would have to already know something about it in order to make that judgment that it was unknowable. So it's a contradiction. If you already know enough about it to determine that it's unknowable, well, then you've effectively contradicted yourself and you've proved that that thing is knowable. So to hold the conviction that you can't know reality is essentially a contradiction. But perhaps more likely, most of the time, I would say that it's a handy escape clause for perhaps not bothering to find out. It's a means by which people can excuse themselves of the responsibility of knowing by declaring that it is impossible to know. So it's essentially a cop-out, you could say, but it's more than that. It's a logical contradiction. The reality we live in, the world we live in, exists objectively, and our power of reason, our capacity to reason with our faculty of reason, is the equipment that is perfectly adequate to knowing it. The fourth and last fundamental idea is that of free will. Now, most of us implicitly hold the idea that we have free will and we acknowledge that in our everyday lives we make choices all the time. Most people are easily persuaded that they control their own thoughts and their own actions, and that fate isn't sort of pulling any strings, as it were, isn't making them do things in any particular day. Of course, if you have to go to work and you have to do things, then things are you have to comply to your commitments and the framework of the context of your life. But in any given day, we are free to make choices. We are free to cross that road or not. But many people in other areas of their life will still entertain the idea of destiny. This was destined that I was going to experience this, or this was fate. It was always going to happen to me. But in the same way that there's nothing predetermined about your choice of when to go to the bathroom, there is nothing predetermined about your life. But the point about this is that when we entertain the opposite view of the idea that we have free will, which is called determinism, when we hold that view to a significant extent, it has several effects, not least of which is to undermine the very concept of truth. If we assume for a moment that nobody has free will, everything is determined, then the concept of truth itself is destroyed. Because if we have no free will, we can't test out an idea. We can't try that idea against that one and see which works. We human beings have to be free to choose and exercise our free will to test reality, to find out what works and what doesn't, to find out what's true and what doesn't. And if in this imaginary reality where everything was determined, there would be no such thing as knowledge. There would be no such thing as truth, because we would all be simply doing what we felt compelled to do as a result of our toilet training or our conditioning and our genetics or whatever other cited reasons. We would be effectively following a script. So this is very important to get the idea that truth is completely undermined if we entertain ideas contrary to free will. And of course, the other aspect of it is, the other big implication is that it is the exercise of our free will in thinking, in pursuing truth, that is the motivating factor in our lives. Our lives don't just happen. They don't unfold according to some script without us doing anything. So the danger of determinism is an undermining of our sense of responsibility to act, to think, to discern truth, and then to act on it. If you ever hear somebody saying, or catch yourself saying, "Oh, that was just meant to be," that is an example of determinism. And some people may apply those things to the realm of existence out there, outside of human choices, should we say. You know, the meteorite crashed to Earth and it was meant to be. But this, again, is to contradict the fundamental nature of the law of identity and cause and effect. Cause and effect stems from the law of identity, and is the law of identity simply applied to action. Things do as they are. Things act in accordance with their nature. So as soon as we start assuming that any particular event we see out there in nature was meant to be, then we are undermining our whole mental framework, our understanding of cause and effect, the law of identity, and free will. So, by way of conclusion, I hope that having a brief look at these four ideas has helped illustrate that they need to be held consciously. We need to be conscious of our convictions, conscious of the ideas that influence our thinking and that motivate and influence our behavior. And if we do that, if we bring these fundamental ideas into our conscious awareness, bring them up here and apply them consistently, we will be better truth seekers, we will be more efficient thinkers in general, and perhaps most importantly, we'll be a lot less likely to fall into the various pitfalls that these ideas, or the opposite of these ideas, present to us. So if you've got some value from this on the YouTube and the other platforms, please hit the like button and do share. Otherwise, please visit the website lawfulrebel.com. Loads more there on thinking and finding truth. And I do hope you'll join me again for another episode of Living Outside the Matrix.
Change you want to see.